Welcome everyone. In this video we're going to have a look together at Louis Bouyer's chapter 7 of his book Introduction to the Spiritual Life. I want to begin on page 212 where he focuses in on this topic of lay spirituality as a peculiar spirituality alongside monastic spirituality and religious life or apostolic life spirituality. He begins this breakout with looking at the lay vocation and what is unique about the spirituality of the laity. It's a very interesting chapter. Many of us in the class are lay people, and so it's very helpful to read what he has to say, going along a lot with the work of St. Francis de Sales too. So this video, I'm going to talk both about Bouyer chapter 7 and Francis de Sales, Introduction to the Devout Life, part 3, sections 35 to 41. So these kind of overlap together on lay spirituality. But back to Bouyer, page 212, he says that there is no fruitful apostolate without personal sanctification, and goes on. So it's that document of the Second Vatican Council, Lumen Gentium, I believe chapter 5, talks about the universal call to holiness. The universal call to holiness that everyone, clergy and laity alike, people in religious life, monastic life, laity, everyone is called to the same perfection of love in our respective states of life. So this is key. Spirituality of the laity, like all spirituality, begins with the vocation to personal sanctification by the grace of God, driven by the grace of God, but requires our cooperation with it, of course. So Bouyer identifies this lay vocation as the vocation of all the baptized in the church. On page 213, alongside this growth in personal sanctification is an abandonment of Satan and to pay the price necessary to do so. So going back to the baptismal promises, they begin, the questions asked to the parents and godparents, say at the baptism of an infant or an older person, asked to them directly, do you reject Satan and all his works and all his empty promises? The profession of faith begins with a renunciation of the renunciation. The renunciation of original sin, the renunciation of Satan and all his pomps and empty works, a disobedience of the disobedience of original sin. So we must abandon the devil and all that he's about that is contrary to the will of God the Father. 215, this is a nice quote about the intersection which makes one's vocation. So Bouyer writes that the determination of our place in existence is always made by the intersection, as it were, of one line which is the resultant of the external circumstances in which we find ourselves placed, with another line which is the resultant of our personal maturation in its most interior aspect, the most irreducible to any external determination. So one's vocation is the intersection of external factors that are out of our control, where we are, where we grew up, our family, our opportunities for education, employment, wherever, but then also what's going on inside of us, our personal maturation in its most interior aspect that is irreducible to any external factor. So it's the intersection of both of these that work together and for us to discern our particular vocation from God. For the sake of time, trying to keep the video short, I'm gonna bounce to his discussion on marriage. This was refreshing after his chapter on the 7 sacraments earlier in the book really just glossed over marriage, kind of put it together with the sacrament of anointing of the sick, which of course there's some connection to be made, but he didn't talk about it too much in the chapter on sacraments. So I'm glad he brought it back for a little fuller discussion on this chapter of lay spirituality. So some of you are married. I too am married, have 6 children, ages 20 down to 6, and marriage is a huge blessing, incredible vocation from God, and I would say my discernment to enter into marriage with my wife Megan, like Bouyer was talking about, really met at this intersection of external factors and internal ones. And at a certain time in my life, when all the things kind of were in alignment, and it seemed very clear to be the will of God, as it does, to this day. But he has some nice quotes about marriage here on page 220 and 221. He really gives a lot of credit to the sacred bond of marriage, as he should. On 220 toward the top, the giving up of all one's goods, of one's own body, and finally of one's own will, which is at the basis of the monastic profession, is, in a certain way, equally at the basis of the marriage pact. Very true. When we look at the vows in the rite of marriage, no matter the rite, Chaldean, Roman, Byzantine, Maronite, etc., we see in those vows inscribed this giving up, this abandonment of self-will, self-determination, and understanding that I'm going to enter into the rest of my life working things out with my spouse. And he goes on to say that the married person, his or her body, is no longer their own. They cannot expect to receive even those joys to which marriage gives them full right unless they also give them. So it's a mutual submission out of reverence for Christ, as St. Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 5, that's going on in marriage. It involves, as he says, further a continual self-renouncement, a continual relinquishing of self. And on 221, I put a smiley face next to this quote when he says, what more abundant source of ever new sacrifices in marriage? Yeah, marriage is an abundant source of ever new sacrifices every day. Husband and wife have the opportunity to sacrifice once again for each other, if there's children, for their children, and in so many ways. So that's a beautiful thing about marriage. It's really a playing field of sacrifice as sacrament, and therefore pointing to the eternal wedding feast of the Lamb. On page 222, Bouyer goes on to talk about fatherhood and motherhood, so essential to human development that in contrast even to married love, they cannot, properly speaking, be sacrificed. Those who, in following a vocation that presupposes celibacy, renounce married love, cannot for all that renounce fatherhood and motherhood. They are simply called thereby to undertake a higher form of parenthood, one not limited to the narrow circle of one particular family, but open to everyone. So what Bouyer is getting at here is every human being, as he or she matures, is called in some way to become more father, more mother to other people, younger people, vulnerable people, disabled people, radically dependent people, and that we're all to exercise this fatherhood and motherhood as we grow older in years in great love and responsibility. And on page 224, he mentions death, which is fitting, thinking about the lay vocation. How do we deal with death? We had some helpful meditations from St. Francis de Sales earlier in the semester on this. But on page 224, we have a quote where he says, to die, when it means leaving those whom we love, is to die in them, as much and more than in ourselves. That's probably, what the greatest tragedy of death. Not even for the individual to go through this existential, you could say, crisis of being, temporary crisis of being, a separation of body and soul, the soul going to particular judgment, awaiting the resurrection of the body at the end of time. But what's so tragic about death is those who still live on earth without the person they love so much. So when I think of my death, that's the worst thought, is what does that mean for my children, or even my wife if I die before her? And that's, I don't like to think about that thought at all. But it's the communion of angels and saints, I think, that reassures us that even when loved ones die, we're not completely separated from each other, but we have an ongoing rendezvous, especially at the liturgical banquet. There's several wonderful quotes. For the sake of time, I won't read them. Pages 226 and following on almsgiving, prayer, fasting, and asceticism, even within the lay vocation. So this is beautiful. Page 227, 228, how he talks about a love that costs you something. That's real love, a love that costs you something. Through the forms of almsgiving, prayer, fasting, asceticism, to give out of our own, not only our own excess, but even our own need. The gift that costs is true Christian love. St. Francis de Sales, for his part, in part 3 of his introduction to the devout life, beginning in section 35, on page 200, writing to Philothea, this character that represents many people, really. He talks about the readiness for martyrdom that's so key for Christian discipleship, that we always should be ready to give up everything for Christ, to give the ultimate witness for his glory, that we should have a readiness of heart about this, even if we live this out in what's called, instead of a red martyrdom, a shedding of blood, a white martyrdom, where there's no shedding of blood on a daily basis, but great mortification, great detachment from all the goods of the world, in order that we approach them with the right order in relation to God, who is goodness itself. On page 205, in this edition, section 37 on desires, he says something very interesting about going back to Satan and Satan's strategies to throw us off track, away from the will of God. He says, the enemy often supplies us with great desires for absent things that we will never encounter, in order to divert our minds from present things, from which, small as they may be, we might obtain great profit. In imagination, we often do battle with monsters, he says, in Africa, so he's writing from Europe. He could have said wherever in the world, Antarctica, but just somewhere far away. Why do we spend all this time and energy in our imaginations doing battle with monsters far away? So he says, in the meanwhile, for want of vigilance, we let ourselves be slain by little serpents that lie in our path. So it's unnecessary. I like the expression, like, don't let the problem, the harm done to you, fester. Don't let it live rent-free in your head. I like that expression when a colleague told me that once. Don't let it live rent-free in your head. So we don't need to do, as what St. Paul says, we should avoid shadow boxing. Why should we be swinging at the air? Our battle is not with flesh and blood, he says, but with the principalities, the powers, the dominions of this world, and in the spiritual realm primarily. Page 207 then, section 38. De Sales, a very powerful quote about marriage, building on what Bouyer is saying. God joins husband to wife with his own blood, and for this reason the union is so strong that the soul must sooner break away from the body of one of them than the husband from the wife. So that's how strong the bond, the marital bond is in the sacrament, that it's like as strong as the relation of the soul to the body, which is an incredible union of the human nature. And finally, a few more pages in, 216 in this volume is the last thing I'll say for this video. And this is in section 39. St. Francis de Sales says that we should enjoy spiritual things, but only use corporeal things, or bodily things, or material things. So it's spiritual goods that we're after to enjoy, not in a spiritually gluttonous way, but still in an ordered way. But this is what we should concentrate on enjoying. As another St. Thomas More says, beware of the pleasures of the flesh that drive out the pleasures of the soul. So many great things to think about in this week's readings. Thanks so much. Look forward to hearing your thoughts in the discussion board.